We are in a Sunday series called Gospel Shorts, where we're looking at snapshots in the life and the ministry of Jesus. And we come to one today that I think is an incredibly interesting one to think through, because we live in probably one of the most secular places in the entire world. That is to say that religion, God, has been pushed out to the fringes for years and years. But the interesting thing is that because Christianity has been so deep in shaping the very roots of Western culture and our culture here, you just can't get rid of it. It's like a whack-a-mole. You know, you hit it in one place and it just pops up in another place. You just can't do it. You find it keeps emerging no matter how hard you try and wipe it out. And one place that you'll find that is in language. So you'll still hear very, very spiritual language being used and employed. And actually, you don't often realize until you just pause and think about it. Now, for the sake of time, I won't go into all of the different ways that we do that. But one of them is when people still talk about needing a miracle. Yeah? And what people mean by that, generally speaking, is that things are desperate. And it is going to take something unbelievable to change the situation. Something amazing, something unnatural would need to happen to change things. If only we had a miracle. Or maybe you hear about somebody who the odds line up in an incredible way, like a lottery winner. Somebody who meets someone after decades and decades of being apart, and you might say, it was a virtual miracle that this thing happened. If only we had a miracle. It would take a miracle to change the situation. But that is obviously religious language. Now, most people normally are not speaking about God. However, sometimes they are. Sometimes people mean it far more literally. They approach Christianity, they start thinking about God because they recognize that they need a miracle. They recognize that for something to change in their life, it will take nothing short of the divine. And look, maybe that's you this afternoon. I mean, this is a church after all. Maybe it's that that's brought you here. Life has reached a point where you're saying, listen, I don't know about anything else, but I know things are desperate enough for change to be needed. Something has got to give here. It needs a miracle. Which is why this passage we heard read from the Bible is so helpful. There's two miracles that follow back to back. And it teaches us so much about miracles, not everything. There is so much more that we could say. But let me three things. Let me give you three things about miracles. We're going to look at the nature of miracles. We're going to look at how you respond to a miracle. And then we're going to look at the one who brings the miracles. The nature, how to respond, and the one who brings the miracles. Here's the first thing. The nature of miracles. So you get these two miracles here, and they're very, very different. The first miracle was searched for, it was requested, and it ends with a very clear and distinct faith in Jesus. The second miracle, it wasn't looked for, it wasn't asked for, and doesn't, as far as we can tell, end with faith in Jesus. One is done by Jesus at a distance. The other is done up close and personal. Let's just step through them both. The first miracle is in Cana in Galilee. And there we meet an official in chapter 4, verse 46. He's described as being a royal official, which almost certainly means he would have worked for the king. But the point is, he has a boy who is incredibly sick. In fact, verse 47 says that his son is at the point of death. Now, he would have heard about Jesus, and he's driven towards Jesus by desperation. And as far as he's concerned, the reputation of Jesus as a healer, as one who could perform miracles, is the only thing that holds out any hope for his son. And twice he begs for Jesus. Verse 47, verse 49, he says, "Come and heal my son, please." He's driven to Jesus in utter desperation. Actually, at least at the beginning, he has very little thought about who Jesus even is. He's just desperate, and he says, "Jesus, you've got a power, and my son needs it." And wonderfully, this is what Jesus tells him. Verse 50, "Go, your son will live." And sure enough, his son, at a distance, is restored to life. He's healed. Jesus never saw him. Jesus never went close to him, but he heals him. Okay, that's miracle number one. Here's miracle number two. This one's set in Jerusalem. And we're introduced to a paralyzed man. He's been that way, we're told in chapter 5, verse 5, for 38 years. That is a long time. That is a long time, particularly when the life expectancy of a male was only around about 40 at this point in history, in this culture. So that's the majority of his life living in this way. And the majority of that life is spent by a pool called Bethesda. Now, this pool is a really significant place because it was surrounded by superstition. It was surrounded by belief. And the belief was that every now and then an angel would reach down into the pool and they would stir up the waters of the pool. And then the first who entered the pool after the angel had stirred the waters up would be healed. Now, the reality was probably a little less cinematic. It was fed by a spring, and the spring led to every now and then the waters kind of bubbling up and causing the stir. But the point is that people really, really believed. They really believed, they really believed that if you were to enter, you would receive healing. That was the belief. And so it was a magnet for the sick, for the diseased, and for the dying. And what happens is that Jesus approaches the man. And in verse 6, he says to the man, "Do you want to be healed?" Now, we'll look at the man's reaction in a moment. But Jesus turns to him, having asked him that. And then in verse 8 of chapter 5, he says this, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." And at once, immediately the word is, he gets up, takes his bed, and he walks. 38 years. And in a moment, at the words of Jesus, he takes up his bed and he walks. That's miracle number 2. So here you are, 2 astonishing acts, 2 astounding miracles from the hand of Jesus. Different, both amazing in their own ways. But here is something surprising, I think, that both show us about the nature of miracles. They show us that miracles on their own are not enough to produce faith in Jesus. That seems strange because surely, of all things, a miracle would be enough to make anybody believe in Jesus. But Jesus here almost seems negative about miracles, about what he calls signs and wonders. He speaks to the official, and by extension, I think he's speaking to the region, the area, those around, and he rebukes them. In chapter 4, verse 48, he says, "Unless you people see signs and wonders, you will never believe." Now, what is that? That's a warning. That's a warning. In a sense, Jesus is saying, careful. Beware of miracles, in fact. Because miracles on their own are not enough. Miracles are designed to point beyond themselves. They are signs. And if you end on the miracle, you miss the point. That's why Jesus comes down so hard, I think. He says, if you can see this miracle and still don't believe in me, you haven't understood it at all. Now perhaps at this point you're saying, well, if I saw a miracle, I'd definitely believe. Of course I would. But here I think is the issue. And it's why it would be as challenging for you as it would be for those in the passage. You can become so focused on everything around Jesus, on the power, the miraculous, that you end up missing him. You become so fixated on all of the surrounding things that you miss the thing itself. You miss him. And that seems to be the tragedy of the paralyzed man, because he's confusing, isn't he? He encounters Jesus so closely. He receives this incredible miracle, and yet he seems to remain in some ways unchanged. At the beginning, he doesn't even know who Jesus is, verse 13. You can see a miracle, but you can miss the person behind it. Do you see that? Miracles are meant to point to Jesus, and unless you get to Jesus through the miracle, you've missed the point. Now, let me tell you why this matters this afternoon, because some of you may very well be holding back. You're saying, well, if I just need to see something, and then I'd believe. That's all I need. I need to see some kind of miracle, and then I'd believe. The passage, you know what the passage says? Well, maybe, but maybe not. Maybe not. It says, don't wait for a miracle. Instead, be brought face to face with who Jesus is right now. Deal with the Jesus that the miracle, however wonderful, however great, however transformative, deal with a miracle as a signpost to point you to the one who does the miracle. Now, all of that is true, but don't mishear this as me coming down hard on miracles, because you can miss the point, but they do point. They do point. And miracles can point powerfully to Jesus, which is the second thing, which is how you respond to a miracle, because there's a significant difference between these two. One miracle leads to a very clear faith, and the other one leaves many, many question marks. Look at the official first. He comes and he just wants the miracle. He's desperate on behalf of his son. Who Jesus is doesn't matter to him, like I said at the beginning. But Jesus uses the miracle of healing his son to make the desperation blossom into full faith. The change begins in verse 50. Jesus says, "Go, your son will live." The man took Jesus at his word and departed. Do you notice here? Jesus doesn't do what he asks. The man says, and he keeps saying, "Come down and see my son. Will you journey with me? Will you come to him? And will you heal him?" But Jesus doesn't do that. He simply turns to the man and he says, "Go, I've healed him." Not a shred of proof. I say that reverently, but not a shred of proof. The Father doesn't turn, though, and say, "No, Jesus, come and really do it. Do it so I can see it." No, there is something in Jesus that instead means he simply says, "Okay, I believe and I trust. I've got faith in you." And look at the blossoming that you see from the next verse onwards. While he was still on the way, his servants met him with the news that his boy was living. Oh, can you just imagine that? When he inquired as to the time when his son got better, do you think he really needs to know? Do you think he's really scratching his head saying, I wonder what time this was? I don't think he is at all. Instead, he gets the answer he knows is coming. They said to him yesterday at 1 PM, the fever left him. And then the father realized that this was the exact time at which Jesus said to him, your son will live. And so what happens? He and his whole household believe. The son is saved, the official is transformed, and his whole household, which is a small word, but one that means family, staff, workers, the whole extended group who would have lived in a wealthy, relatively wealthy person's home. They all trust in Jesus. They see him for who he is. At first, who Jesus was didn't really matter. By the end, it was the only thing that did. He becomes a witness to the life-bringing, heart-changing reality of Jesus. That's what a miracle should do. That's who the miracle is designed to bring you to. The miracle, do you see that? The miracle ceases to be the amazing thing. That's the note it finishes on. It is not on, isn't this miracle amazing? It's on, this is Jesus, the one who's transformed my son and now the whole household. Love this. Love this. Now, hold down your mind and just contrast that with this paralyzed man. Because in the account, there is no mention of faith in Jesus. 38 years unable to walk, but in the account, there seems very little towards Jesus. There's no gratitude. There's no appreciation. There seems to be kind of indifference towards Jesus. His only reaction is to report back to the authorities to confirm it was Jesus who healed him. And that's really only because they told him to. So what's going on? Well, you get an insight from Jesus into what I think is going on underneath the bonnet. Listen to what Jesus says to him in chapter 5, verse 14. He says Jesus goes back, finds him at the temple and says to him, see, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you. Do you hear that? The problem of sin has not been dealt with. There's something worse there, is almost certainly Jesus saying, and if that sin remains in you and is never dealt with, you will face something far worse than any physical condition. The man, let me put it this way, the man had cured his body, but was still sick in the one place that really counted, his soul, his heart. And only Jesus could address that, but the man literally seems to walk away. He gets a change from Jesus, but he misses the deeper change that truly matters. The deeper change actually that Jesus wants to bring in all of us, to deal with the sickness in our souls, to deal with our sin and save us from something worse. Jesus says that's where your bodily healing must bring you. And this man actually represents a response to Jesus that still you see so often. One writer put it this way: this man is a representative of unbelief going nowhere in faith. I wonder if that's you today. Maybe it is that you are desperate for something from Jesus. You want something from faith. Any number of things, actually. You want something healed, a healing in the body. You want happiness brought. You want a relationship fixed, a situation taken away. Now, none of those things are necessarily bad. And in fact, all of those may very well happen. But if you can walk away from him once you have them, then you've missed the real treasure. You've missed the thing of true and deep significance. See, that's the warning here. But there's an encouragement as well. And here's the encouragement. Jesus' kindness and grace is so great that he allows us to approach him with messed up motives. There is real patience that Jesus shows here. In fact, his patience is part of the question to the paralyzed man in the beginning. He says, "Do you want to get well?" And maybe you think, what an entirely unnecessary question. He spends his life by a pool where people are desperate to get well. Of course, everyone knows the answer. So why does Jesus ask the question? Jesus is nudging him to go deeper, that's why. He's getting him to see where his hope really lies. He's inviting this man to draw closer to him. And then, like I said, Jesus even goes back a second time to draw his heart out further. He goes and finds him for a second time in the temple. Even though the man has not come and found him, the man hasn't expressed gratitude, the man at that point doesn't even know his name. Here's the encouragement. Jesus allows us, you, to come to him with mixed motives. But he doesn't want you to stay there. Let me make that as concrete as I can. You may be here today out of all kinds of mixed motives. Right now, that doesn't matter. Do you know what matters most? It's that you're here. It's that you're here. And the significant thing now is what you do. That's what matters. What you do as Jesus still, as fresh as it was then, encounters you now. There is an invite to come to him. The invite, be careful, is not go back to the beginning and wait till you have pure and clean motives. If you wait for that, you will wait forever. The invite instead is to come in all the confusion, in all your questions, with all your mixed motivations, and meet him here. The nature, the response. Here's the last thing. The one who brings the miracles. You say, hold on. That's the same thing that you've just told me in the last two things. That's what I do. This is about Jesus. Of course it is. Think about what it shows you. His power. Oh, yes, it shows you his power. So clear. Jesus' power is absolute. He speaks without ever seeing the sick boy and brings him back from the point of death. He doesn't need healing springs. He doesn't need human assistance. His words are enough. He tells the man to walk. He takes up his bed and he walks. Total healing in an instant. The power of Jesus. But here's the other thing you see. The authority of Jesus too. Because Jesus heals this man on a Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath was the Jewish holy day, and one of the commandments of the Sabbath was to keep it as a holy day, a day unto God. But the religious authorities, by this point, had layered law upon law about what you could and couldn't do on a Sabbath. And so, by this point, they had 39 different classes of work. That some were allowed, some were not allowed. And so you get the craziness of the religious teachers that their first response to a man paralyzed for 38 years who has just been healed in an instant is carrying his mat. Their first response is, never mind that you're walking, never mind that you've just been healed in an instant, what's that under your arm? Because it looks like a bed to me, and it's a Sabbath. You don't get to carry one of them. You see, I think you're supposed to read that and go, what? How could they not see? And that's exactly the point. Jesus had broken no biblical regulation, by the way. Here's what he'd broken: a religious tradition. Jesus does that all the time. But let me make us all feel a little more uncomfortable with this. Do you know what the real issue is? Jesus broke their frame of reference. That's the problem. They had absolute narrow window of what was acceptable and what was not. And here comes Jesus, and he won't even fit in the aperture. He won't even fit in the frame. He breaks out through the window, and they do not know what to do with him. So instead they revert back to what makes them feel comfortable. He shouldn't be carrying the bed. You see, all of us in some way, shape or form have views of Jesus. I don't know what your views of Jesus are today, but here's what I'm pleading with you. Don't make the same mistake. Don't let what you think of Jesus get in the way of the reality of Jesus. You may think all kinds of religious things about Jesus. Do not let that blind you to the truth of who he actually is. You may think all kinds of irreligious things about Jesus. Do not let that blind you to the reality of who he is. Instead, take him at his own terms. Take him on his own terms. Be like the royal official. Just walk with me. Walk with me in this for a moment. But I'm going to return to this in a few weeks. Be like the royal official. Take him at his word. And see what happens. Don't come saying, Jesus, this is what I think you should be. Instead, come and say, Jesus, I'm not sure, but will you show me what you're actually like? I'm going to close here. John, the author, describes these miracles as signs. I've spoken about this, but look specifically at the end of chapter 4, verse 54. This was the second sign Jesus performed after coming from Judea to Galilee. Now, John is an incredibly careful writer. And everything that John does within his gospel is just, it's there for a reason. So as he uses that phrase, he's inviting us to make a link. And here is the link he's inviting us to make. It's back to the very first miracle of Jesus you find in his gospel. In chapter 2, Jesus is at a wedding, and famously, he turns water into wine. Do you remember? And can you guess what the miracle is described as? A sign. John even reminds us of the miracle in verse 46. Did you notice that? Once more he visited Cana in Galilee, where he turned water into wine. Why does John keep doing this? What's the link? Well, in that first sign, as he turns water to wine, Jesus is showing us he is the joy bringer. He is the one who came to invite all to the banquet of God. And anyone who comes to follow him can join in God's festival joy. He came as the chosen one, as God's promised Messiah. In the Old Testament, the promised Messiah was God's king who would come and he would bring God's joy upon the face of the earth. And he would also come, do you know what he would come as too? As healer. As healer. He was pictured as the one who would snatch life back from the grave. Listen to one of the promises you find in the Old Testament, in Isaiah chapter 35, about this one who was promised. And verse 5, then he will open the eyes of the blind, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer, and the mute tongue shout for joy. That's exactly what Jesus does with the second sign. He comes as the healer. But why does Jesus go to a pool to heal a man? He seeks him out at the pool. Well, the image of water is a powerful one. In the first sign, Jesus uses water as he turns water to wine. And there he uses the pots that people would have used to cleanse themselves. And as he does that, Jesus says, no, I come to bring a different kind of water, true cleansing that will flow from me. And then the chapter, just earlier in chapter 4, you see that Jesus is by a well. And there he encounters a woman, and he tells her by the word, you have a raging thirst deep down in your soul, and nothing else will quench the thirst other than the waters that I bring, and only I bring. And now here, at a pool of water, he shows a man that religious superstition, that faith in the waters of a pool for healing won't transform him. They never can. But Jesus will. He shows the man that the healing he brings will flow like true waters that will break over his life and more, will break over the whole of creation to reverse all of the brokenness. Listen to how the passage from Isaiah goes on. Isaiah 35, verse 6, water will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. The burning sand will become a pool, the thirsty ground bubbling springs. In the haunts where jackals once lay, grass and reeds and papyrus will grow. Jesus is the one who comes to bring springs in the desert. He comes to bring fruit in the barrenness. Not like the vague, superstitious hope of a magic pool, but the one who will bring true waters to the truly dry places. Listen, you do need a miracle. I need a miracle. We all need a miracle, but maybe it's not the one that you think you need today. You need the truest, deepest kind of change. More than saving from physical illness, more than saving from material situations, more than even saving from physical death, you need spiritual life. More than your need for anything else. Jesus says that's what all of us need. And that is the promise that Jesus holds out to every one of us today, to be the true and living water to all who would come and drink from him.